The First Indochina War has different significance to a wide range of different people. For some, it's the first stop on the road to American involvement in Southeast Asia. For others, it's an example of a fight for national liberation, a shining example of how to defeat imperialism. For others, it's an example of the growth of communism in the developing world following the Second World War. And to be fair, it's all of these things and more. But it's also a relatively understudied conflict, especially in comparison to the resistance war against America to save the nation that followed. The First Indochina War was a war of two halves. The first half, which we covered in a recent episode, was one marked by guerrilla warfare and partisan struggle. The second half, however, saw an anti-colonial movement form a conventional army and take on a European state in open combat and achieve victory, something that has rarely ever been repeated. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at the second half of the First Indochina War and explore how Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam achieved their independence. This is the Cold War. Okay, so in our last episode, we had gotten up to the major turning point that was 1949. Or if not the major turning point, then the beginning of the turning point. 1949 was not only the year that the Associated States of Vietnam were created, a French-dominated federated state consisting of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, led by former Emperor Bao Dai, but it was also the year that Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV, found hope of a significant international ally. Mao's victory in the Chinese Civil War and the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, provided an ideological ally right on the DRV's doorstep. Many of the Vietnamese in the DRV leadership had spent significant amounts of time in China, either as participants in the Civil War or as political refugees and agitators, including Ho himself, and they knew many of the PRC leadership as a result. The hope was that these ideological ties and friendships would foster greater support for the DRV. The creation of the ASV still left Paris in charge, but presented a veneer of independence for the three states. Think of this like a sleight of hand, a move designed to shift international perceptions of the war from being one about colonialism, and instead, as would be emphasized by Paris, one about fighting a communist insurgency. This was designed to allow the French to lean on Cold War tensions and internationalize the war by bringing the United States on board. Much of what we talked about in our last episode was focused on events taking place in Vietnam. Makes sense, right? Well, yes, but since this is the Cold War, there is an international dimension that really begins to present itself by 1949. The United States, which had largely ignored Southeast Asia, was really embracing the Cold War spirit of fear and paranoia that global communism was going to sweep the world. McCarthyism and the Red Scare were moving into high gear domestically, and disloyalty to the United States was suspected under every rock and around every corner. Into that mix came the so-called loss of China when Mao won the Civil War and established the PRC. I will admit, however, that I am as yet unclear as to who made China the US's to lose, but that's a whole other subject. In Washington, the Hawks had plenty of grist for their mill, and this forced Truman and everyone around him to take a much harder line against anything even smacking of communism, lest they be tarred with the brush of un-Americanism. Further to this, communist-inspired uprisings were ongoing in Malaya, the Philippines, Burma, and Indonesia. Indochina sat in the middle of all of this with its own communist insurgency, and fear in the West was that if a communist Vietnamese state was established, the rest of Asia, including possibly India, would fall in short order, like dominoes or something. Now, knowing that the United States, despite its own hidden empire, was a strong advocate of anti-colonialism, the French saw their opportunity to gain a patron. The formation of the ASV in 1949, that vaguely federal state composed of Tonkin, Annam, Cochinchina, Cambodia, and Laos, as nominally independent states in a federal union under the leadership of Bao Dai, was the French attempt to shift the perception of the war from a colonial endeavor to one centered on anti-communism. In reality, of course, the French remained in control of defense and security, finances, and foreign affairs of the new state, making Bao Dai a puppet, but it was hoped to be enough of a veneer to gain backers and support in a war that was costing Paris more every year it carried on. The US was, especially at first, wholly unconvinced. But 1949 had a series of other events that shifted things. 1949 was the year that NATO was formed, and the US was very much keen on ensuring that France remained a strong and viable defense partner in Europe. France, still rebuilding after the war, had to prioritize where to spend its francs, and while the maintenance of empire was deemed important, if some of its imperial ambition could be underwritten by a global superpower, then that made things a little easier to still focus on Europe. 1949 was also the year the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. For the United States, this really helped to bring the Cold War home, as the nuclear monopoly was broken and highlighted that the Soviet Union, and communism, was more technologically advanced than many had been led to believe. And finally, as already mentioned, the establishment of the PRC late in the year reinforced the apparent strength, and therefore threat, of communism. The United States felt compelled to act. Okay, so back to the situation on the ground in Indochina. French control was largely confined to urban areas and the major roads connecting them, although their levels of control over the roads could be tenuous as, well, the result of Vietminh hit-and-run tactics. Cochinchina in the south saw deeper levels of French control than the north, although it is important to note that this control can be considered somewhat chimeric, as anti-French sentiment was still significant, but Vietminh's strength in the south was significantly lower than in the north, and so the situation was generally more pacific. French troops, approximately 100,000 in number, were spread across the territory, often parceled into small garrisons holding towns, outposts, and forts. The high number of garrison troops left only a small number of battalion-sized combat groups available to conduct mobile operations. The Vietminh, for their part, had control of an archipelago of territory with significant strength in the rural areas of the north and two major staging areas, the highly defensible Viet Bac in the mountainous and forest-covered territory north of Hanoi, and a less defensible but resource-critical territory around the Red River Delta, rich in rice and manpower supplies. The Vietminh's army, the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, consisted at the very beginning of 1949 of approximately 100,000 soldiers with relatively poor supplies, relying on weapons captured from the French, as well as limited supplies being provided from the Chinese, who at that point were still fighting their own civil war. A small cottage industry of weapons manufacturing had been initiated, allowing for a supply of landmines, grenades, and even a crude bazooka to be made. Rice supplies, taken from growers across Vietnam, including the Ca Mau region in the far south, were transported across Indochina in a growing secret logistical supply chain that included shipping, but was largely dependent on manual transport across the entire region. This type of supply chain that was being developed was to play a critical role for decades to come. PAVN soldiers were organized and trained for guerrilla operations, lightly armed and mobile in the hills and mountains, the forests and jungles that covered large portions of Vietnam. Direct assaults on French positions were not possible, so ambushes of units on patrol, or especially of supply convoys moving between French positions, was the best option. French forces were better armed and better supplied, but suffered from some significant drawbacks. The first I just mentioned, the overall number of troops available to conduct offensive operations was limited. Troops were required to man garrisons and fortifications across Indochina. Tactically, the French were also not in their element. French doctrine relied on mobility and weight of fire, both of which were often heavily restricted in the rugged environments of northern Vietnam. Poor roads hampered the ability to move anywhere quickly, which also limited the ability to move and use artillery, on which French doctrine relied. Likely the biggest drawback faced by the French armed forces in Indochina was a lack of overall manpower. Paris would not allow the use of conscripted French soldiers in Indochina for fear of the political backlash that would result from what was, ultimately, an unpopular conflict. This limited the French military to only the deployment of volunteer soldiers from the metropole, as well as colonial troops, including men recruited or impressed in Indochina itself. This last category of soldier was considered to be not very reliable at all in what was, after all, a war of national liberation. But this manpower restriction also meant that the French didn't have enough soldiers to consolidate and keep territory they gained in any offensives. They could advance and take territory from DRV control, but didn't have enough troops to leave behind for garrison and consolidation duty, and the DRV simply moved back in as the French withdrew. But between 1946 and 1949, the PAVN was also building the core of a more conventional army. Communications teams were being developed to ensure the ability to coordinate large groups. A sophisticated logistics program was being developed, as just mentioned. Intelligence gathering and analysis teams were also developed, including both human and SIGINT capability, both vital for fighting a modern war. The framework was being built by the PAVN to eventually take the war directly to the French. Incidentally, for those of you interested in military theory, this was taken directly from Mao's theories of warfare. The PAVN had withdrawn to secure areas, they were holding their own territory, and preparing for the third step to be able to attack and win. The first step towards that came at the start of 1949, when the DRV government introduced mandatory military service. Conscription allowed the PAVN to leverage their years of organization and to rapidly increase the size of their forces from about 100 to 120,000 soldiers at the start of 1949 to over 400,000 soldiers in 1950. Now, as mentioned, and as I am sure most of you can imagine, the Chinese victory in the Chinese Civil War had a tremendous impact on how events were to unfold in Vietnam. The DRV and Mao's communists had already been cooperating for years, but by 1949, Ho and the DRV were allowing Chinese soldiers access to Vietnamese territory to create not only staging bases from which to launch attacks on KMT positions in southern China, but also to allow Chinese soldiers the opportunity for rest and recuperation. Some PAVN units were also transferred to China in the latter half of 1949 to participate in the final campaign against the nationalist Chinese, giving them valuable combat experience as part of a more conventional armed force rather than just the guerrilla tactics they had been conducting. Now, on the diplomatic front, the establishment of the PRC initiated a whirlwind of changes that fundamentally changed the course of the war and ultimately the region. In the words of Vo Nguyen Giap, Vietnam was no longer in the grip of enemy encirclement and was henceforth geographically linked to the socialist bloc. Ho and the DRV petitioned Mao and Beijing to formal diplomatic recognition, which was officially extended in January of 1950. Mao used his position to petition Stalin in Moscow to do the same, a recognition that was eventually, and somewhat grudgingly, extended. In February of 1950, Ho met with Stalin in Moscow and even went so far as to ask for a Treaty of Mutual Assistance, a request that Stalin denied, instead indicating that the Soviets would not directly support the DRV, but that Mao and the Chinese were to be the agents of communism in Asia. Despite this, with Moscow's recognition of the DRV, the other socialist states in Moscow's orbit rapidly also extended recognition to the DRV. Of course, this type of action by Moscow could not be ignored by Washington. Diplomatic recognition of the ASV was rapidly extended by the United States, with other nations like the United Kingdom following soon after, each pledging different types of support. American support couldn't consist of actual soldiers on the ground, but Washington could, and did, ramp up the amount of arms and war materiel being sent to the French in Vietnam. They also began to financially cover costs for the French conducting the war. Almost overnight, the situation in Indochina, which, let's be honest, up until that point had gone on in a corner of the world of which very few people on the global stage knew or cared about, to the center of national attention of several global powers. In the words of historian Tuong Vu, the DRVs joining the Soviet camp also set up a chain of reactions. It alarmed the United States, which together with its allies immediately countered by offering diplomatic recognition of the French-backed State of Vietnam's government headed by the former king Bao Dai. So, with all the changes that had gone on in 1949 and in early 1950, the DRV began to change its strategy. Working with a Chinese military advisory group, CMAG, that had been created to assist the PAVN, the decision was made to go on the offensive. The PRC began to funnel significant amounts of weapons and materiel to arm and equip the expanding PAVN, and it included not only rifles, machine guns, and uniforms, but artillery, anti-aircraft guns, communications gear, and eventually rocket artillery. The Chinese goal was to help convert the PAVN from an outfit capable of guerrilla warfare into one that could conduct conventional military operations against a peer opponent, which was, in this case, France. Route Coloniale 4, or Colonial Route 4, RC4, was one of the main roads that the French had created, running roughly parallel to the Chinese border from Tianyan near the Gulf of Tonkin, through Langson, Dongke, Caobang, and ending roughly north of Nguyen Binh. While DRV forces had been conducting attacks and ambushes on French outposts and convoys along RC4 since 1947, General von Nguyen Giap made the decision that more conventional attacks would be made with the aim of taking and holding territory. RC4 made sense from this perspective, as the French outposts were strung out along narrow supply lines, making reinforcement and supply difficult. Vitally for the DRV's war effort, though, would be the consolidation of the controlled territory along the Chinese border, allowing for much freer movement of supplies from China to the DRV. An attack by approximately 25,000 Vietminh troops on the French fort at Dongke in May of 1950 cut the supply route between Caobang and Langsong, but French paratroopers retook the fort within a matter of days. Giap spent the next few months conducting ambushes and raids on French supply convoys, while the French withdrew from smaller positions into more concentrated positions at Dongke and Caobang. On September 16th, Giap's forces launched an assault on the French garrison at Dongke, held by approximately 300 members of the French Foreign Legion. Although the legionnaires held for 2 days, Dongke was captured by the Vietnamese, cutting the supply road between Langson and Caobang. The French commander in Indochina, General Marcel Carpentier, fearing a direct intervention by Chinese troops, made a decision to withdraw forces from Caobang. These forces were to move down RC4 towards Dongke, which was to be liberated by French troops that were assembling at That Khe and Langsong. These forces included the French Foreign Legion's 1st Parachute Battalion, as well as a mix of colonial troops from several parts of North Africa. The French force moved north from Langson on RC4 from September 30th, with the retreating force heading south from Caobang, setting out on October 1st. Both groups were slowed by ambushes from the up to 10 battalions of Vietnamese troops, including an artillery regiment that Giap had assembled, but they did meet at Dongke on October 5th. As the united French group turned to withdraw back towards Langson, however, they were ambushed in the Coq Chave Gorge, and the force was largely destroyed. Of the approximate 6,000 French soldiers that were involved in the retreat, there were only about 700 who managed to return to French-controlled territory. The 1st Parachute Battalion was all but wiped out, as was the 3rd Colonial Commando Parachute Battalion. This is notable as the parachute troops were considered to be the best and most well-trained French troops in Indochina. Their destruction came about not as a result of poor training or morale, but the genuine success of the Vietnamese attack. This victory, however, came at a price. While the official Vietminh reports indicated about 1,000 dead and 1,500 wounded, more credible estimates, including historian Fredrik Logevall, put the number of Vietnamese casualties at approximately 9,000, or 30% of the force involved. I should point out here that while there were approximately 30,000 PAVN troops involved in the battle for CR4, they were supported by a huge host of other people, as many as 121,700 according to historian Christopher Gosha. They had been mobilized to support the army in the field. They acted as porters, couriers, cooks, laundrymen, and women. The PAVN logistical network was low-tech, with little mechanization available, and therefore relied on manpower to keep the PAVN in the field. The battle to capture control of CR4 is estimated to have absorbed as many as 1.7 million working days of labor from the local population recruited to support the DRV. The French loss at Colonial Route 4, described by journalist Bernard Fall as the greatest colonial defeat of the French since Montcalm's loss of Quebec at the Plains of Abraham, had huge strategic implications for Indochina. The French began a withdrawal from the northern portion of Tonkin, conceding a huge portion of territory to the DRV, who now not only controlled large portions of contiguous territory, but vitally, that territory shared a direct border with their new ally, the People's Republic of China. This allowed trade and supply routes to be established, or re-established as the case may be, simplifying the movement of Chinese aid to the DRV and the PAVN. It also allowed for the movement of Vietnamese goods to markets in China to help finance the Vietnamese war effort. With the DRV having struck a significant blow against the French, they now held the initiative and they looked to capitalize on it. Setting their sights on Hanoi and Haiphong, PAVN troops began to advance. The French reaction was decisive and, as it turned out, effective. New leadership was appointed who quickly moved to turn things around and provide strength and security for the French by holding back Ho, Giap, and the Vietnamese seeking independence. The continuation of this story will come in a new episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss the next episode of our coverage of the First Indochina War, please make sure you've liked and subscribed to the channel and have pressed the bell button, which is currently setting up an ambush against a remote column of other bell buttons which are retreating without air or artillery support. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.